record. Okay, it's
Okay,
recording.
great.
It's recording.
Yeah, okay, excellent.
So again, thanks for doing that.
Looking forward.
We best actually start by that you would give a short introduction to your position.
Yeah.
What are your ideas about the field and the relationship between philosophy and neuroscience, and particularly your approach to it?
Yeah. So I jotted down a couple of thoughts about that. So since my 2003 book, I've gone almost strictly what I call meta-scientific. And that is an attempt to just try to say exactly how it is that particularly molecular biologists, molecular neuroscientists, and even biochemists and things like address these kinds of issues in the lab. So I started off, as you know, kind of squarely within the Churchlands approach. And my first book, basically the psychoneuroreduction book, was basically written, the one that came out from MIT, was basically written strictly within a kind of Churchland perspective on things. The real shift is when I got to the University of Cincinnati and started working close with then state-of-the-art molecular neuroscientists and said, wow, all this stuff on reduction that I've been working on doesn't translate into what's going on, what I'm seeing in the lab. And so here are these people that call themselves reductionistic. They're called reductionistic by their fellow neuroscientists. And so what exactly are they doing to distinguish their work from other people who are less reductionistic? And that became kind of my overarching goal, to try to tell the story from the perspective of laboratory science in practice, as to what reductionism is kind of in day-to-day laboratory research. And it turned out to be not anything at all like what I had characterized earlier, or what I learned from the Churchlands, or what I learned from other people about what they thought reductionistic was from a philosophical perspective. So that kind of neuroscience, that kind of meta-scientific approach became kind of my driving ambition. Tell the story of reduction or explanation or mechanism strictly from the perspective of a descriptive account of what these scientists were doing when they were using those particular terms, or when they were doing an approach themselves in kind of a self-consciously reductionistic approach. And it turned out to be just a really different project than anything I was seeing in philosophy that was going on at all. So
I'm quite happy that you say that. If you don't mind, I would like to just ask something. What did you think?
Yeah, let's do it.
So I agree with you. When I went into Stuart's lab, philosophy kind of failed me, like the philosophy of science. I was like, this is not what's happening. What did you find? What didn't translate?
Right.
What was kind of not working?
What didn't work was this conception of theory. This conception of theory that was so dominant in philosophy of science as what science was all about, just was almost no part of day-to-day scientific research. I mean, yeah, people were theorizing. People they weren't just sitting there observing or anything like that. They were, but this kind of overarching picture that what we're doing this for is to fill out this thing called theory, which is not what I was seeing going on in day-to-day lab science. Really, I saw people instead. They're trying to do measurements. They were trying to correlate, behavior with these underlying mechanisms that they were manipulating. So there was all that going on. And sure, theory was there. I mean, no one was under any impression that they were, like directly observing, proteins or something like that. No, not at all. But it was not, the idea was not to kind of like flesh out this thing called brain theory that so many people in philosophy seem to be so concerned about. And at least the neuroscientists that I was working with, it wasn't a part of their day-to-day work. So that's where I started thinking more and more in terms about two things. One, experimental design. What exactly are people doing when they're designing these experiments? Why are they making these choices? Because one of the first things that struck me when I got into Norm Weinberger's lab at Irvine was that, we would read these papers and that had these fascinating conceptual ideas in them, and then would spend time talking about why a particular speed of film was used, or why a microscope, or an electrode of a particular diameter was chosen. I'm sitting there going, wow, all these great ideas floating around. Why are we talking about this? And it seemed clear to me after a while why we're talking about this. That's what mattered to what they were doing, what the work they were doing. I mean, Norm was trying to measure experience-induced plasticity in auditory cortex. And what mattered to him was getting those particular measurements or getting that particular setup that would deliver reliably this kind of data. It was not to figure out, you know, how the brain processes sound. Sure, that was involved, but the day-to-day work was so different from what I had come even from the Churchlands to expect from neuroscience, that it just kind of struck me that we've been asking the wrong questions. And if we really want to understand how science works and why it gets the results it gets, we need to pay more attention to just day-to-day laboratory work. So that was the approach. And it turned out to be, you know, a very different picture of what reductionism is all about, or what experimental design is all about, or what science is all about, than what I had learned even from Paul and Pat.
So that brings us to the question, like when it comes to reductionism, it's kind of an unpopular position in philosophy, and it's sort of also now a little bit tutted at even by scientists. Like they're more and more, we should do networks, we should go away from classic reductionism. And like you, I actually think there's a misconception about reductionism here. So my question to you is like, well, what do you think are the biggest misconceptions or the hindering misconceptions that people have about reductionism, and what are your replies to that?
Well, so one we'll talk about in just a minute. It has to do with complexity. And there's no doubt about that. There's a line that suggests that reductionism, for whatever it is not going to be able to handle the kind of complexity that now can be documented or that we think exists with regard to something like the brain. So we'll come back to that one separately. But there's another one, I think, that's been around for a long time. And it truly is a misconception. I mean, I think there's a real fight about how to handle complexity. I think there's a real issue about what's the best way to handle complexity. It's a genuine issue in science. But there's another misconception about reduction that's been around for a long time that is truly a misconception. And that's the idea that reductionists only offer accounts of structure. They only offer, is almost as though reductionists are purely anatomists and can say nothing about function or dynamics. And that's just simply wrong to the core. I mean, if you go and look at what's going on in molecular biology or even in biochemistry, it's trying to figure out dynamics. It's trying to figure out how these things do what they do in these pathways that they operate. And so this idea that reduction is just a matter of kind of producing underlying structure and it completely leaves a functional story out, that's a misunderstanding about the science. That's not a debate about what direction the science can go. That's just a simple misunderstanding of what these people are doing. And that's one that has to be cleared up. But that's one that a lot of philosophers, even philosophers concerned with reduction, have tried to point out the mistake in for a long time. We'll go back to Cliff Hooker's famous 1981 trilogy of papers. Hooker is absolutely clear that he is not just simply structure. He's given an account of the underlying dynamics and how those underlying dynamics kind of ratchet up to explain behavior or anything. So that's something I think that needs to be cleared away. The idea that reductionism is only about structure and completely leaves out dynamics or function. And that's one that's been around for a long time. And that's one that's just simply mistaken about the science. Not mistaken about, or it's not a hypothesis about what direction the sciences should move to handle complexity. That's a real issue. But the idea that reductionists only talk about structure, that's a misconception of what molecular biologists do. That's a misconception of what biochemists do. That's just a misconception of how the science works.
So I totally agree, and this is why often, so when I had the conversation with John Bickle, for instance, I told him like, well, I don't think that a process ontology is in opposition to reductionism. And I actually think it shows us how to revise like our understanding of reductionism away from this, as you say, just structure or just anatomy or just pinning things down to things and to carve out things. Like, no. The point of, for instance, a good account of reductionism is to show that these processes are what what we want to understand as mental phenomena.
Yeah.
And in that context,
Yeah.
you partly already gave me an answer to that, but I would like to push you a little bit on that, because what this implies when you say we need to go away from just thinking of reductionism in terms of structure, but we have to look at like the mechanisms, the interactions, the processes, is like basically it seems also that what this implies is to be a bit more clear on what we mean by the materiality of reduction.
Sure. Yeah.
And it seems to, especially yeah.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, so it seems to me actually quite often when we talk, especially about like mind-brain issues or reductionism in neuroscience and philosophy of neuroscience, philosophy of mind, we're kind of ignoring the materiality. So the stuff you, for instance, are interested in when it comes to tool use, where you actually interact with the materials, you're trying to get this out of it. And if we look at philosophical positions that go, oh, functionalism or dualism or what have you, it kind of, and even the Churchlands connectionism kind of ignores the really, really deep down material side of things. And I wonder, what do you think if we were to look more actually, why is it that organisms actually develop consciousness? Is there something, get away from AI, get away from the potentiality of artificial consciousness? We have things that are conscious. What is it about that kind of material that allows us to be conscious, that allows us to do certain things we call cognition or that we call perception? So what do you think we need to think differently about materiality?
Yeah, I just wonder where that will go. I mean, because I'm fine. I'm kind of fine with the perspective on materiality. That, for example, I mean, I've got my dispute with the mechanists when it comes to reduction and things like that. But nevertheless, I think they were a huge force in philosophy to get at least an account, to get an idea that, the stuff that does the pushing and pulling matters. And even though I think they've got this, my dispute with them turns out to be strictly a meta-scientific dispute. But nevertheless, I think they did something that the likes of the metaphysicians like him and the kind of reductionism that I've been offering just never kind of made contact with in philosophy. And that's to bring people to the attention that, mechanism matters, and therefore biology matters, and molecular biology matters, and they were able to pull that off. Where the rest of us, I've never convinced people quite as much as the mechanists did, that kind of materiality, kind of stuff that does the pushing and pulling matters for philosophical investigation. And what goes on in the mechanistic sciences is different than the approach in the more theoretical aspects of physics. They succeeded, the rest of us, I think, didn't, in bringing that to the attention of the broad. So I want to give credit. I've got my disputes with the mechanists, but nevertheless, they succeeded in kind of bringing that to the attention of philosophers, where the rest of us, either the metaphysicians or the hardcore meta-scientists, didn't connect that issue up with a broader philosophical community.
So what would you say is the issue with the mechanists?
Oh, my issue with the mechanist is really one about, so the mechanists have, some of them call this, Taylor calls this mechanistic reduction, Craver calls it mosaic unity, but the key point that they share that I don't share is the idea that you've got these nested hierarchies of mechanisms within mechanisms, almost like those Russian dolls, right? And the mechanism of a particular system are the components of that system and its dynamics and its organization. And so they balk at the idea of, say, a molecular mechanism of cognition. No, those molecules are the mechanisms of neuronal plasticity, which are the mechanisms of circuitries, which are the mechanisms of behavior. And they've got this kind of nested hierarchy of mechanisms within mechanisms, and it winds up being this layer that I think is just simply inconsistent with the way that the molecular neurobiologists doing molecular cognition talk. So we're just disagreeing on a meta-scientific level. I think there's an approach within neuroscience, molecular and cellular cognition, that literally they are uncovering the molecular mechanisms of cognition, not of neuronal plasticity, but of cognition in and of itself, because they've got the tools that enable them to make these interventions in molecular pathways, and they are showing the effects directly on behavior. And they're claiming that behavior is an indicator of a cognitive function. And when I manipulate these mechanisms, I am manipulating the molecular mechanisms of cognition. And that is what scientists are committed to denying by this nested hierarchy of mechanisms within mechanisms. And I think they just fail to account for what the molecular and cellular cognition folks say in their papers, what they're doing. And so I think it's the mechanists who have to translate what these scientists are doing into this mechanistic perspective, and it just does not translate well what these scientists claim to be doing. So my fight with the mechanists is strictly over whether or not, say, molecular pathways can be the mechanism of cognition. As a ruthless reductionist, I claim they can be, and in fact, there's a science that is directly showing that those are the mechanisms of cognition, and are claiming that when they report their results and explain what they're doing. So I think both the experimental design that they're using and their discussion of their results fits better with this kind of intervene at increasingly lower levels of mechanisms and track the effects on behavior picture that the ruthless reductionists, rather than the nested hierarchy of mechanisms within mechanisms that the mechanists, Bechtel, Crave, or others like that, Glenn and people like that, have stressed, especially the ones that pay serious attention to neuroscience, like Bechtel and Craver.
So it's kind of interesting, because the nested hierarchy actually opens up criticism to reductionism, like what connects this level, what connects that level. You have to have these bridge principles, and then you're ending up in linguistic dispute about like what this bridge principle is it really translating? And I think to say like, no, you're actually, like, there is no thing to bridge is a much better way, because the other thing just opens up many problems. But this is precisely why I said, like, the approach you're having is, this is why we need to look at the actual material level, at the tool level, because this is our only way to intervene with something. And which distinguishes your position, for instance, from the Churchlands, and also like a couple of other kind of even practically oriented, let's say, philosophers of neuroscience.
Let me say one thing about Paul and Pat, though, because you made the point earlier on in our conversation, which is dead on. They were speaking to an audience at a particular time, and that was really important for their views. I mean, remember all the way back to his 79 book, his first book, Paul was after this alternative to the sentential view, the sententialist model of representation. He was looking for something other than sentences and their components and their logic-like manipulations as a basic framework for explaining cognition. And that goes all the way back to the 79 book, the very first book of Paul's. So remember when they were, and this comes from his background with Sellers. I mean, he was looking for this broad overarching framework to replace that sentential model with. And so, he's kind of, he and Pat stumble upon this paper of Linus's from the mid-'80s, right? Where Linus models the cerebellum and offers a kind of vector space explanation for how processing in the cerebellum works. And Paul kind of goes, oh man, that's exactly what I've been looking for, because it's non-sentential, it is vector-based, vector transformations. Wonder what you could do with this. Now, of course, he's doing this installation, the PDP group, which is putting it all together in San Diego at this time. He doesn't know much about them. I mean, he kind of stumbles on this paper of Linus's, modeling the cerebellum. Then, of course, he writes this paper, basically builds his own little crab-like creature, artificial creature, that basically transforms sensory motor coordinations in vector space terms. He's off the seat of his pants, okay? Just kind of using this idea from Linus. And he kind of hypothesizes that this might be a model for cognition generally. a year later, he and Pat moved down to San Diego, and he discovers there's a research group going on down there, the PDP group, that's doing exactly what he's been looking for. And so you can see why he was so attracted to what they were doing. He wanted this grand overarching placement for the sentential model for cognition, and he saw it being developed right before his eyes when he got down to San Diego. I mean, no wonder it occupied him for the rest of his life, the rest of his career, okay? It was exactly what he had been looking for his entire philosophical career. And so, and pretty short at that time, but, so there was a reason why they were so attracted to connectionism, and it was because of this kind of broader framework it seemed to promise as a replacement for the sentential model for cognition. And you could see that in the collection of essays in his 89 Neurocomputational Perspective. And one of the arguments he always gave was that, that this kind of connectionist approach was eliminative, because he and Pat had the eliminativism going by then, and they were of course famous for Paul's 81 paper and some of the follow-ups to that. But here he thought, this is going to turn out to be eliminative, because we can't identify sentential structures or logic-like transformations with vector spaces and vector space transformations. They're just different kinds of beasts. So here's real scientific basis for eliminative materialism, i.e. the elimination of the sentential model from folk psychology. That's why they found that so attractive. But it really was a matter of just kind of what was happening at the time and who they were talking to. And then that dispute, of course, went its own direction, because, Fodor and Paulician a couple years later published their famous paper in Cognition, saying, arguing that connectionism, really does not produce this alternative model, that if it's going to handle systematicity, and if it's going to handle all these other features of cognition, it's going to have to be sentence-like in its foundations, or else it's simply going to be a kind of physical implementation, blah, blah, blah. That took off in its own directions, and argued about that for 5 years till consciousness arose, and consciousness became an issue, and everybody started talking about that. But the key point for the Churchlands was, I think, the reason why they, until Pat rediscovered the molecular basis of ethics, and later on in her career with oxytocin and vasopressin and all that sort of stuff, there was a reason why they were so enamored with the connectionist perspective, and it really was a product of the times. That it was a product of Paul's grander what he was looking for from his background in Sellers, and the mere fact that a group that he simply discovered at San Diego were developing exactly what he had been calling for since his graduate school days. So
I like that story. I really.
That's a history that must be, that seems to have been forgotten.
It seems to be, because now people are like, yeah, sure, obviously, but it wasn't obvious back then. It was actually quite a discovery. And what I like is as you said, like we discussed this before I started recording, very, very briefly, but it's often forgotten that they were addressing a philosophical community at that time. Yes. And now they actually don't bother with them anymore, because they're like, okay, I don't have time for this. I want to do more interesting stuff. But they did transform the philosophical debate, and that's that heritage, that they were responsible for that shift, which now we actually adopt freely, that they were actually pushing this is often forgotten. They're kind of, ironically, they're reduced to the idea that they want to get rid of consciousness, which is what they never said. The obvious,
Or they want to get rid of representation, which was never the case. I mean, they just thought that there was a different model for representation than sentence-like structures and logic-like manipulations. That was their, and they're convinced that whatever their brain was doing, it wasn't at least in its normal, everyday kind of processing, it was not manipulating sentences, and it was not doing logic-like transformations. It was doing something else. And that didn't mean there weren't representations. That didn't mean there wasn't consciousness, but it did mean that our ultimate explanations for these things were going to be different because they were not going to be in terms of sentential structures or logic-like representations. That was the Churchlands line. And that was their line from the beginning. And you know, eliminative materialism, you know, in some sense, it's such a double-edged sword. I mean, the Churchlands never would have been as famous or as philosophically influential without eliminative materialism. But in some sense, eliminative materialism was a sideline to their main what I think their main contribution was, and that was reformulating philosophy of mind issues into philosophy of science terms, and trying to address and thereby trying to allow scientific, especially neuroscientific considerations into play in determining answering philosophical questions. That and eliminative materialism, of course, is what caught philosophical attention. Because it was such a surprising kind of thing that people were arguing for this. But nevertheless, I think in some sense it put them on the map and made them as important as they were for philosophy. But in another sense, it is not the main important philosophical ideas that are in the Churchlands. So there's a weird kind of irony going on there.
I totally agree actually with that, because I often saw their kind of way of doing philosophy of neuroscience science as a kind of a program. It's like rethink the philosophical notions with which you're operating, both in philosophy as well as the philosophy in science, so to speak, and kind of ask new questions. Think about how our intuitions might deceive us, how our assumptions are more born out of intellectual heritage rather than the actual material. So this is why I often say it's the Churchland program. So but you had, I would like to come to that, because it's something that really intrigued me, because speaking of, well, kind of revising, it's kind of a revisionist approach to science, revisionist approach to philosophy, where at the heart lies folk psychology. And this is where people get kind of antsy about the Churchlands, like about beliefs and desires, so things that are real for us and that are also real in social circumstances. And you have this in your chapter about the Churchlands. I was reading that, I was like, oh, hang on a second, I gotta ask you about that. So one way say, so when we look back at the ancient Greeks or at medieval times, it's kind of strange that we find it takes us a lot of effort to get into that framework to understand how the cosmos and biology and physics, but their plays and their art, we find ourselves. So why would we, and it's often kind of used as this assumption that this shows that there's a general human nature, that the mind is what the mind is, and that what we experience is the reality. And you turn this around and say, like, okay, why do we think that, like, we easily accept that their biology was wrong, that their physics was wrong, their cosmos was wrong? Why do we actually still keep on the same folk psychology then? Like,
well, exactly. Well, you know, I mean, Fodor almost comes out and makes that argument that, you know, folk psychology is right because it's our basic nature, and for something very much like these reasons, and in that appendix, the psychosemantics. I mean, he almost comes out and says it. But now Paul, this was one of Paul. So, if we go back and look at the famous 81 paper, there's almost no neuroscience in that paper except at the very end when he's kind of like speculating about ways to go beyond folk psychology. No other neuroscience. The arguments there are strictly critical arguments aimed at folk psychology. And one of the central ones is this argument, you know, this one from the rest of the ancient Greek world, the picture that they drew of the cosmos, we now have just simply replaced by an alternative, you know, that you know, if we use the language of the 1960s philosophy of science, which Churchland was perfectly happy to do, it's incommensurable, to use old Firebindian language, with the language, with the approach, the conceptual framework of science now. Why would we think it would be any different with regard to the Greek psychology? It's still our folk psychology, but doesn't it stand to reason that we're so wrong about everything else that they were probably wrong about this too? So when we finally do get our act together and get a neuroscience up and running and figure out exactly how cognition works, doesn't it stand to reason that folk psychology, the ancient Greek, will go the same way as their biology and their physics? That was one of Paul's central arguments in the 81 paper. The critical paper, that before he had this framework to replace folk psychology with, he was raising critical arguments against folk psychology, why we should think it's probably going to be eliminated eventually. Now, so that was one of his arguments, and I was admitted to being pretty attracted to that argument. I mean, because the contrary response that, oh well, folk psychology is correct, and we have just kind of this access to the structure of our mental states. I mean, just it struck me as kind of highly implausible. But nevertheless, that was Paul's argument. But then, what about this kind of argument that some people have had that, well, don't you see? That's why folk psychology is special. That's why we do, we do have some kind of access to our own mental life that we don't have to the external world. And so folk psychology kind of basically describes human nature. Now, the Churchlands here are just fascinating on this particular point, because this is where Paul's old plasticity arguments come into play, right? That if we can learn new theories, Paul talking, not me, Paul talking. If we can learn new theories, we can learn to apply these theories perceptually, and that's not only going to be a matter of new ways of speaking. That's going to be a new way of experiencing. That's going to be a new way of perceiving. So what the geologist sees when the geologist looks out there and sees striation and all this stuff is different from what I see. What the molecular biologist or the biophysicist sees in the electron microscope slide is different than what the person who just looks at it naively sees. Yeah, okay, but for Paul's idea was because we take these theoretical frameworks that we learn and we apply them perceptually, and it changes the nature of our sensory and perceptual experience. That's been his argument again since the 79 book. And that's where this idea comes that, when he says things like in the 84 paper, so if we could only come to learn this emerging neuroscience, we could come to experience our own our own brain states. And that would be a fundamentally different way of understanding ourselves than would be it understanding it through the theoretical lens of folk psychology. I mean, that's the idea. And so the idea being that our human nature is ultimately, kind of neuroscientific, and we're being misled into thinking that we believe and desire and the like, because that's just the lens through which we're interpreting our introspective experience. That's a theoretical lens through which we're interpreting it. That's always been the Churchlands idea, and that could change. As the neuroscience emerges, as we learn more about it, we can learn to reconceive our own experiences in its terms, and that won't be just a different way of talking. That will be a different way of experiencing. Yeah. I mean, I was really attracted to that argument when I was in graduate school and, down around, hanging down there. I mean, that I guess I'm a little less enamored by it nowadays.
What's your hesitation?
What's that?
What's your hesitation? Why do you say it changed, your attitude towards a change?
I think what changed is just, again, I think I came to see that view as so theory-centric. Right, because it's the idea is that theory is at work behind everything, and I've just become less enamored with that particular view, and so I think that what do you do with those old arguments from the 1960s by Hansen and people like that about these kinds of this kind of plasticity of perception, the theory laden perception? I don't know. I mean, becoming less enamored with theory and seeing science as less concerned with just simply theory progress and concerned with other kinds of things not related to theory progress is maybe a little more skeptical that theory is so influential on our perception. So I guess it's something like that. I've just kind of given up. The Churchlands, remember, the Churchlands are theory-centric. At least Paul was theory-centric to the core. He bought all those arguments from 1960s philosophy of science and related that theory determines what we see, what we think, and all that. And I've become less convinced of that, of the overlying importance of theory than I was back when I was, kind of just more squarely working with a kind of Churchland perspective. It's intriguing, though. I mean, because the idea that I can turn around and see the world differently by learning. There's something just downright intriguing about that idea. But I guess I'm a little more skeptical about the global impact of the kinds of things that are called theory that are needed for that particular approach to work. I'm just a little more skeptical that they're quite as systematic for our way of thinking as the Churchlands and some other people are that are so theory-centric.
So I would agree with, you can't just have the theory. I'm currently more enamored by that argument for the simple reasons that it makes a lot of sense for me through the lens of olfaction, of course. But there is something which I wonder, especially, I agree with you, it can't just be theory. That being said, having this perspectival change, this so to speak Copernican evolutionary shift, it helps us also to pin down material features we overlook in another theory that might be our new angle. And I'm currently reading this book very, very slowly because it's not well written, I gotta be honest, but it's an interesting idea. And it's by this German guy, Nordhoff, and it's called The Spontaneous Brain. And he says we need to go away from mind-body dualism and this kind of debate, but to look at brain-world interaction. And the angle for that is the spontaneous activity of the brain. The brain is never addressed. There's always random activity. So he tries to understand the interactivity through the spontaneous activity, the self-activity of the brain. And I'm very intrigued by that because it has the material component. It changes the way what we consider are the stabilities or structures because it's actually based on processes, but it does link it down to material interaction. There's no extra sauce or kind of special wizarding one going, here's the mental and here's the material. So it kind of reminds me a little bit of the at least the approach the Churchlands have with that means we have to adjust our theoretical notions, but also what you have, look down at what's happening actually on the molecular level. So for instance, spontaneous sound.
I mean, on this, look, I've read some of Nordhoff's work, and things like that. And you're right, he's hard to read. But nevertheless, the one worry I have about that entire approach is again, just clearly, any approach, any explanation of the brain is going to have to account for the fact that energies are impinging on the sensory receptors, and the sensory receptors are responding to energies out there in the world, right? Retinal cells, auditory cells, thermal cells, all that is going on. So clearly there is world-brain interaction. But there's another thing there too. There's also world-brain separation. That those energies are impinging upon, kind of like skin-bound and retina-bound cells responding specifically to those energies. But then everything gets transduced from physical energies out there in the environment into the currency of the brain, and that is electrochemical processes inside this. So I can never quite buy the complete world brain immersion because of the fact that there's this transformation that happens at the sensory receptors into a different kind of energy. than the energy that's impinging upon receptors. And so there is a barrier between brain processing and the world. They are not continuous. And that is always one of the reasons I avoided kind of, the kind of externalist approach that has become popular in some quarters of cognitive science and some quarters of neuroscience, because it just seems to me to be inconsistent with the fact that at those sensory transducers, a transformation of energy from one type into another type takes place, and there is not this seamless immersion between brain and world. There is a separation, and that separation matters for what happens in internal processing. So that's always been my beef against these kind of radical externalist programs. I just think they're inconsistent with the basic facts of sensory transduction in the nervous system.
But that I like that, because it brings it down precisely to what I think is the most important part. Like, what is the material characteristics, the features from which we should theorize, rather than just that has to fit our theory.
But, well, that's why you're working on olfaction. Olfaction, I mean, as you've been pointing out so well, it's such a neglected modality because of the fact that there's a lot of reasons why it was neglected, but nevertheless, the thing is here though, so you actually have a chemical component that that interacts directly with the receptors. It's not photonic. It's not photons. It's an actual chemical component that interacts with those receptors. And so, it's in that sense, it's what is it like? it's like gustatory too, but they're often treated together. But yeah, it's too bad, as you point out, it's too bad that vision became kind of the paradigmatic sensation. I mean, you can see why it was, because it's so important for us as mammals, and especially as Homo sapiens. But nevertheless, these chemical transducers have a kind of materiality to them, both in the nature of the receptor organs themselves and the nature of the external stimuli. And that's a kind of fascinating feature of olfaction, gustatory, some of these senses, that's different from vision, where basically the external feature are photons with their complementary properties, or even audition, basically compression waves in the atmosphere. That's a different kind of materiality than is a chemical component binding to. That's what makes them so fascinating to look at as a case study. So
I agree totally, obviously, but so. Because we're close, it's 12 already, and I don't want to hold you to it, but I would like to at least finish with one more kind of provocative question. Because so in class, we've been kind of revolving around the notion of folk psychology and neuroscience, something we kind of touch upon now a couple of times. And this is like the last question, because thinking about the issue of, especially the argument to say, well, we should stop with our inherited understanding of folk psychology, where we think, oh yeah, the Greeks were right, etc. Maybe they weren't, and maybe we're just kind of clinging on to a tradition. Right. But does that mean, if there's potentially no folk psychological communality, that there is not what the humanists would like to think of human nature? Is there human nature then? Not does eliminative materialism, or at least this kind of radical approach to we have to change it? Because I was wondering, like, before you answer, there might be actually something happening now that I wonder whether the Churchlands will pick it up, especially Pat, actually, is the question of Well, now with especially the move everything to, like, we're moving everything to online interactions, not just already for a while now, social media, now we're teaching online. So we are lacking an embodied experience of communication, and we now have kids growing up without that. And I wonder, because I noticed one particular thing, Twitter can annoy the hell out of you because it doesn't fit your folk psychological intuition of how communication works. You have an order of discourse, you have a temporal order, you have an immediate of discourse, and it's confined to a group. Now you can have somebody responding to something a year later, or you've got five different people saying different things. It doesn't fit our embodied understanding of communication, and it grinds you. It grinds you really. And I wonder to what extent the kids who are growing up with that now, like who are now, I don't know, 8 years old, give them 10 years, they will have perhaps a different folk psychology of how communication works through the online experience.
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating idea. I mean, you know, it's and I mean, I hate. I'm such a human communication. I mean, look, it's great that you and I can communicate like this, and we have students for a seminar. Excellent, okay, but there is something different than if we all were sitting in a room and talking, and it's hard to put your finger on what's different, but I'm convinced that there's something different about it, and that difference, I think, is something that is an important part of something called human experience, human communication. And if we were the case that for the rest of our lives, for whatever reason, because this pandemic turns out to be worse, and we have to, something would be lost in the fact that we can't, you know, get together somewhere and all be in the same room and communicate this stuff one-to-one, or, you know, when in groups, in real groups. Something would be, and I think lacking in the communication. Now that just could be because, you know, I've adapted to the electronic media world as best I'm going to be able to. I'm not comfortable in it. And if someone grew up in it, they might be far more comfortable and find it far more natural than I do. I still find, you know, no matter how helpful these kinds of interactions are, I'm convinced that there will be something we would get out of the interaction if all of us were sitting in a room together talking this that we're not getting right now. Now, again, that's the hardest thing to put your finger on what it is. And I struggle with trying to say what it is here, but it strikes me that something is. And again, is that just a matter of, you know, sort of, hey, boomer, you just grew up when people interacted humanly, you know, die off, and, you know, and we'll get rid of your, or is there something, I don't know. I mean, but look, I get the exact same kind of feeling. Well, I mean, we can go on. This is a huge topic, but it's one I've got some thoughts on. I get the exact same kind of feeling when I think about sort of like this transition period in past human cultures, when we went from, you know, what Vico would have called the heroic society to these, you know, to the world of human, you know, kind of like contemporary civilization. Yes, incredible gains were made by that transformation, but something about the human character and the human potential was lost in that transformation. Hard to say what it is, very difficult to say what it is, but something is missing. And again, I've got some examples of some films that we could talk about sometime about, I think, that are beautiful reflections of this kind of unblinkered nostalgia, where you're not being nostalgic for a past age, you know, in a silly way, but you're actually trying to point out that something was done back there that is no longer part of the human experience now, and that is a loss for humanity. May not be an overall loss. There might be benefits that followed that, but it's still a loss. Something is gone that was once there. And I think I can think of a kind of a similar kind of way with the questions you're asking right now.
So I'm actually curious. So before we, because my suggestion is that we soon, like, I stop recording, and I'll have a couple of questions for you afterwards. But I was wondering, have you read Celia Hayes' Cognitive Gadgets?
I have not, and it sounds like it's
You
something
should
I
read.
probably
I
have
think
because
you will like
yeah, exactly. Other people have told me about it too.
I think you will really like it, because she makes a wonderful case for saying, well, if we look actually at the causal interactions, we have to rethink it. Not everything is basically innate, but there is a lot of cultural transmission that creates new cognitive mechanisms.
Interesting.
And they would also, I think it would fit nicely in a modern sense with we have to rethink folk psychology based on the scientific evidence. What is really innate? What is learned? And is every mechanism really just property of the mind, or is it something we also create through interaction, and how also this affects actually cognition and the neural basis of cognition?
Interesting.
Like she looks at how children learn and the imitation thing, how they learn their own body, and then in mirroring with other people. It's very, very interesting. So I'm curious what you will make of it.
Oh, good. Okay, good.
So I would say I'll quickly stop recording, and then let's have a couple of minutes.
Sure.
Okay, let me just